A big hand shot up, palm open, ready to come down hard. Below it, a young woman flinched and threw her arm across her face. A cup lay shattered at her feet, wine bleeding across the floorboards. The man towering over her swayed on his feet, drunk and shaking with rage. He grabbed a fistful of her hair. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She had learned long ago that begging only made it worse. Around them, 100 people stood frozen, watching, saying nothing. Then a low growl cut through the hall. A three-legged wolfhound dragged himself between them, teeth bared at the man he'd feared his whole life. The young woman's name was Elowen, and in the next 10 seconds, a king would cross that hall and do something no one there had ever seen. What happened next made grown men weep. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up a little, because to understand what happened in that hall, you have to understand the girl on the floor. Elowen Marsh had lived her whole life in Raven Hollow Pack, high in the frostbitten mountains where the wind never really stopped. And in all those years, nobody had ever stood up for her. Not once. She was an Omega, which in that pack meant she was born at the bottom of everything. Omegas didn't lead. Omegas didn't argue. Omegas served the table and cleaned the hall and kept their eyes on the floor. That was the way it had always been. And Elowen was quieter than most. Here's the thing you need to know about her. She wasn't quiet because she was weak. She was quiet because she'd been taught, year after year, that opening her mouth got her hurt. Her father, Broderick Marsh, was a big man with a red face and hands like slabs of stone. He'd been a fighter once before the drink got him. Now he was just angry. Angry at the pack for forgetting his name. Angry at the world for shrinking his life down to a cold cabin on the edge of the territory. And angriest of all at the daughter who reminded him every single day of the wife who died bringing her into the world. He never said that last part out loud. He didn't have to. Elowen could read it in his face every time he looked at her. She had learned to move through her own home like a ghost. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew how to pour his cup so he wouldn't complain. She knew the exact sound his boots made when the drink had turned mean, and how many seconds she had to make herself small before it landed. Believe me, that's a terrible thing for a young woman to be good at, but she was good at it. She'd had a lot of practice. The only warmth in her life had 4 legs. Well, 3 of them anyway. Barnaby was an old wolfhound, gray around the muzzle, with a stump where his back left leg used to be. He'd lost it years ago in a trap on the North Ridge. Broderick had wanted to put the dog down then. Said a 3-legged hound was useless, another mouth eating food they didn't have. But Elowen, 10 years old and shaking, had begged. It was the only time in her whole life she remembered begging and winning. She'd nursed that dog through the worst of it, feeding him scraps from her own thin plate, and Barnaby never forgot it. Wherever she went, he dragged himself along behind her. When her father raged, the dog put himself between them, taking kicks that were meant for her. A broken girl and a broken dog. That was the whole of Elowen's family. And in Raven Hollow, nobody thought that was strange, and nobody thought it was their business. Now, once a year, when the last harvest was in and the first hard frost came down off the peaks, the whole pack gathered in the great hall for the harvest feast. It was the one night everyone came together. Every family, every rank, from the highest warriors down to the lowest Omegas who did the serving. There was firelight and roasted meat and barrels of dark wine, and for a few hours the cold outside didn't matter. Elowen dreaded it every year, because a feast meant her father drinking, and her father drinking in front of the whole pack meant she had to be perfect. One wrong step, one spilled drop, that was all it took. This year, though, was different. This year the pack had a guest. Word had come down the mountain 2 days before, and it had set the whole territory buzzing. Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn was coming to the feast. You have to understand what that meant to people like them. Ronan Blackthorn ruled every pack in the northern mountains. Raven Hollow was just one small piece of his kingdom, tucked in a corner, most kings would never bother to visit. He was a legend, enormous, dark-haired, scarred from old wars, with a voice that could stop a room cold. He didn't travel to little harvest feasts in forgotten valleys. Except this year, for reasons nobody understood, he was. The pack cleaned and cooked and polished for 2 days straight, and Aloan worked harder than anyone. Her father made sure of that. He grabbed her chin the morning of the feast, his breath already sour with drink, and told her that if she embarrassed him in front of the king, he'd make her wish she'd never been born. She believed him. She always believed him. So that night, Aloan kept her head down and her hands moving. She carried platters heavier than she was. She filled cups and cleared bones and dodged between the long tables. And at the high table under the light of the great fire sat the king himself. He was everything they'd said and more. Ronan Blackthorn filled his chair the way a mountain fills the sky, but it wasn't his size that struck her. It was his eyes. All through that feast, while the pack laughed and drank and pretended not to stare, the king watched, quiet, still. And more than once, Aloan felt those dark eyes land on her as she moved through the hall. She told herself she was imagining it. A king had no reason to look at an Omega. She kept her eyes down and kept working. Her father sat 3 tables back and he was drinking fast. Aloan watched him out of the corner of her eye, counting his cups. 4, 5. His face was going red. His voice was getting loud. And that cold knot was forming in her stomach, the one that told her the night was about to go wrong. By the time the moon was high, Broderick Marsh was well past drunk. He was slamming his cup on the table and demanding it be filled, telling anyone who'd listen about the warrior he used to be, the battles he'd won, the respect he was owed. People had started to edge away. And Aloan, seeing the empty cup raised and shaking in his fist, hurried over with the wine before he could start shouting her name across the hall. That was her mistake. Rushing. Her foot caught the edge of a bench. The pitcher tipped, and a splash of dark red wine went across the table and into her father's lap. The whole hall seemed to go quiet at once. Broderick rose out of his chair like something coming up out of deep water, slow, terrible. His face had gone past red to purple. And Aloan, standing there with the empty pitcher in her hands, did the only thing she knew how to do. She apologized. She backed away. She made herself small. It didn't matter. He came around the table fast for a big drunk man. The first shove sent her stumbling back into a support post, hard enough to knock the breath out of her. The pitcher shattered on the floor. And then his hand was in her hair, twisting, dragging her head back, and the whole pack was watching, and not one single person moved to stop it. This was normal, you understand. This was just Broderick and his girl, not their business. He raised his other hand, palm open, and Aloan shut her eyes and waited for it to land, the way she'd waited 1,000 times before. But this time, something got in the way. Barnaby. The old 3-legged hound had dragged himself across the whole length of that hall, and he threw his body against Aloan's legs and turned to face the man he'd feared his entire life. His hackles were up. His lips were peeled back, and from deep in his gray chest came a growl that silenced the room. Broderick looked down at the dog and something ugly crossed his face. "You," he snarled. He drew back his boot to kick the animal aside. And that's when a hand closed around his wrist and stopped it dead in the air. Nobody had seen the king move. That was the thing people talked about for years afterward, how a man that size had crossed half the hall without a sound and had Broderick Marsh's raised arm locked in his grip before anyone even understood what was happening. Ronan Blackthorn didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just held the drunk man's wrist in one enormous hand and looked at him, and the whole room held its breath. Broderick tried to pull away. He couldn't. The king's grip didn't move a hair. "You will not," the king said quietly, "touch her again." Then he let go, and Broderick, suddenly aware of 100 eyes and the king's dark stare, staggered back and dropped into his chair, mumbling, deflated, small. Two of the king's guards stepped forward and stood over him, and just like that, it was done. Elowen stood frozen against the post, her hands trembling, not understanding. She braced for what always came next. Someone would tell her to clean up the mess. Someone would blame her for the scene. That was how these things went. But the king didn't turn to the crowd, he turned to her. And Ronan Blackthorn, ruler of all the northern mountains, a man before whom warriors bowed, walked over to a shaking Omega girl and slowly, deliberately lowered himself down. He knelt, on the floor of that hall, in front of the entire pack, at Elowen's feet. You could have heard a pin drop. He reached out, not to grab, not to strike, but gently, and touched the back of Barnaby's gray head, calming the growling dog. Then he looked up at Elowen with those dark eyes, and for the first time in her life, someone looked at her like she was worth something. "Are you hurt?" he asked, just that. Two words no one had ever bothered to ask her. Elowen couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. She shook her head, no, even though it wasn't true, and the king nodded slowly and stayed there on his knees, and for one long moment the terror drained out of the room and something like peace crept in. The danger was over. The monster was in his chair with guards on either side. The king himself was kneeling in the firelight, gentle as anything, and Elowen thought, she really thought, that the worst was finally behind her. She was wrong. It hadn't even started yet, because from 3 tables back, still slumped in his chair, Broderick Marsh started to laugh. It was an ugly, wet, drunken laugh, and it cut through the quiet like a blade. Everyone turned. And Broderick wiped his mouth and pointed a shaking finger at the king kneeling on the floor. "Kneel all you want," he slurred. "She's not yours to protect, she's already sold. There's a contract, signed and sealed. She belongs to Alpha Garrick of Ironmore, and he's coming to collect her tonight." And just like that, the whole thing changed, because this wasn't about a drunk father's temper anymore, a temper you could stop with a strong hand and a hard look. This was a contract, this was pack law, and in the mountains a signed claim bond was a sacred thing, older than kings, binding even to the man who ruled them all. If Broderick had truly sold his daughter to another alpha, then no amount of kindness could undo it. She wasn't being threatened with a slap now. She was being handed over. For life. Ronan Blackthorn rose slowly to his feet and turned to face the drunk man, and his voice, when it came, was very cold. "Explain." Broderick, too drunk to know fear, grinned. Alpha Garrick of Ironmore ruled the pack over the eastern ridge, and everyone in that hall knew his name. He was rich. He was cruel. He'd buried 3 Omega wives already, and nobody liked to ask how they died. Months ago, Garrick had come through Ravenhollow and seen Elowen serving at the tavern. He'd wanted her. And Broderick, drowning in debt from the drink, had sold her for a purse of silver and the promise of more. The bond was witnessed. The papers were real. Garrick was already on his way up the mountain. The color drained from Elowen's face. She had known nothing about any of this. Nothing. Now, before this goes further. If you felt your chest tighten watching this poor girl get sold like a sack of grain by her own father, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Because what the king did next, and the truth he uncovered about who Elowen really was, is the part you'll want to see all the way through. The great doors at the end of the hall banged open on a gust of freezing wind. Alpha Garrick of Ironmore walked in with 6 of his warriors at his back. He was a lean, hard man with pale eyes and a smile that never reached them, wrapped in a fur cloak worth more than most families in Ravenhollow earned in a year. He looked around the silent hall, saw the king standing over the Omega girl, and his cold smile widened. "Your Majesty," Garrick said, with a bow that was just a little too shallow to be respectful, "I didn't expect the honor, but I'm afraid you're standing rather close to my property." He crossed the hall and stopped a few feet from Elowen, looking her over the way a man looks over a horse he's bought. She shrank back against the post. Barnaby growled and Garrick kicked at him without even glancing down, catching the old dog in the ribs. Barnaby yelped and stumbled but didn't back off. He planted himself in front of Elowen again, shaking, guarding her with the last of his strength. Something in Elowen broke, watching that. Her whole life she'd been the one who couldn't fight back. And here was this crippled old dog taking a boot for her one more time because it was the only thing he knew how to do. She stepped forward and put herself in front of Barnaby, for once shielding him instead of the other way around. Garrick laughed. "So it does have a spine. Good, I like a little fire, it's more fun to break." He held up a rolled parchment. "The bond is signed, witnessed by 3 elders of this pack. Even a king cannot break a lawful claim bond. You know this, Blackthorn." He turned to the crowd. "Or does the king mean to spit on the oldest law we have?" And here was the trap, because Garrick was right. That was what made it so terrible. Pack law was pack law, and the king's power came from upholding it, not breaking it whenever it suited him. If Ronan tore up that contract by force, he'd be no better than any tyrant, and every alpha in his kingdom would learn that the king's word meant nothing when he didn't like the outcome. The elders of Ravenhollow were already murmuring, nodding. The bond was real. They'd witnessed it. Their eyes went to the floor, ashamed but unwilling to speak against the law. Elowen looked up at the king, and she saw the trap close on him too, and her heart, which had lifted for one impossible moment, began to sink. But Ronan Blackthorn did not look defeated. He held out his hand. "Show me the bond." Garrick hesitated, then handed it over with a smirk certain of himself. The king unrolled it and read it slowly in the firelight, and as he read, a strange thing happened to his face. The cold anger there shifted into something like disbelief. His eyes moved down the page and stopped, and went very still. "This bond," Ronan said slowly, "names the seller as Broderick Marsh, father of the Omega Elowen Marsh." He looked up. "By what right does he sell her?" "By the right of blood," Garrick said impatiently. "He's her father. A father may bond his unmated daughter. That's the law." "Yes," the king said, "a father may." He rolled the parchment closed. "But this man is not her father." The hall erupted. Broderick surged to his feet, shouting, but the guards forced him back down. Garrick's smile flickered, and Elowen felt the floor tilt under her feet. The king turned to her, and his voice gentled again just for her. "May I see your left wrist?" Confused, trembling, Elowen held out her arm. The king pushed back her worn sleeve. And there, on the inside of her wrist, was the small silver birthmark she'd hidden her whole life, a mark shaped like a crescent moon over a star. Her father had beaten her for it when she was small, called it a witch's mark, made her keep it covered always. She'd grown up ashamed of it. The king looked at that mark for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, tears stood in the eyes of the most powerful man in the mountains. "I have been looking for you," he said, his voice rough, "for 19 years. He rose and turned to the pack, and he told them a story almost no one there was old enough to remember. 19 winters ago, a great alpha had ruled the northern mountains before Ronan, a just and beloved king named Aldrich Silvermark. Aldrich had a newborn daughter, marked at birth with the silver crescent of his line, the sign of the true blood. But there had been a betrayal. A rival had murdered Aldrich and his queen in the night and tried to wipe out the whole bloodline. The infant daughter had vanished. Everyone believed she died in the fire that took the old king's hall. The kingdom fell into war. And a young warrior named Ronan Blackthorn, who had sworn his life to Aldrich, had spent the years since fighting to hold that kingdom together, and searching, always searching, for the lost child he'd failed to protect. He'd sworn on his king's grave that if she still lived, he would find her and give the throne back to its rightful blood. "I heard a rumor," Ronan said, "of a silver-marked Omega in a forgotten valley. That is why I came to this feast. I did not truly believe it. I have followed 100 rumors and buried them all." He looked at Aloin and his voice broke. "But it is you. You are Aldrich's daughter. You are the lost heir of the mountains. And you have been living in a cold cabin, beaten by a man who is no more your father than that dog is." Aloin stood there and could not breathe. Her whole life turned over in an instant. The man she'd feared and served and tried so desperately to please was not her father. She had been taken as an infant. Broderick had found her in the ruin, seen the silver mark, and kept her not out of mercy but out of greed, meaning to use or sell her when the time came, and never letting anyone see that mark until now. "That's a lie," Garrick spat, but his voice shook now. "A trick to break my bond. She's an Omega, a serving girl, nothing more." "She is the daughter of King Aldrich Silvermark," Ronan thundered, and this time his voice filled the whole hall like the crack of the mountain itself. "And no man sells the blood of the true king. Your bond is void. It was signed by a man with no right to sell her and no claim to her name. Bring it before every elder in my kingdom and they will all say the same. The law is on her side, Garrick. Not yours." The elders of Ravenhollow looked at the silver mark on Aloin's wrist, and one by one they knelt. They remembered the old king. They remembered the mark. There was no arguing with it. The bond of a false father was no bond at all. Garrick's face twisted with rage. He saw his prize slipping away, and being the kind of man he was, he did the only thing men like him ever do when the law turns against them. He reached for his blade. "Then I'll take her by right of the challenge," he snarled and lunged. He never made it. Ronan Blackthorn had been a warrior long before he was a king, and he moved like the whole mountain coming down. He caught Garrick's sword arm, turned it, and put the man on the ground so hard the flagstones cracked. Garrick's warriors moved, and the king's guards met them, and for a few short, brutal seconds the hall was full of the ring of steel. But it was over almost before it began. Garrick lay pinned beneath the king's knee, his blade skittering away across the floor, his 6 warriors disarmed and forced down. Ronan leaned close to the beaten Alpha's ear, and his voice was very quiet and very cold. "You kicked her dog," he said. "You came into my kingdom to buy a frightened girl like meat. You will spend what's left of your miserable life in the deepest cell I own, and every Alpha from here to the sea will know why. Take him." They dragged Garrick out into the snow, still shouting, and the great doors boomed shut behind him. And then the king turned to the man still slumped at the table, Broderick Marsh. The man who had stolen an infant princess from a burning hall and raised her as a slave. The man who had beaten her, starved her, and finally tried to sell her. Ronan didn't touch him. He simply looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he turned to Aloin. "He is yours to judge," the king said. "By blood and by right his life is in your hands. Speak, and it is done." The whole hall waited. And here was Aloin, this timid girl who had never once been allowed a voice, suddenly holding a man's life in her word. Everyone expected her to call for his death. God knew he'd earned it 100 times over. But Aloin walked over to Broderick, who cringed away from her now, small and terrified, all his cruelty drained out of him. She looked at the man who had made her childhood a thing of fear, and she knelt down, the way the king had knelt for her. "For 19 years, she said quietly, you taught me that the strong hurt the weak because they can. That's all you ever taught me." Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. "I won't be your student anymore. I won't kill you, not because you deserve mercy, you don't, but because I finally get to choose what kind of person I am, and I choose to be nothing like you." She stood up and turned her back on him. "Send him away. I never want to see his face again." And Ronan Blackthorn looked at her with something close to wonder, and he nodded. They took Broderick away that night, out of the pack, out of the mountains, banished for the rest of his days. Aloin never did see his face again. The The hall was silent, and then from somewhere near the back an old Omega woman began to cry, and another, and then the whole pack, all those people who had watched Alolan suffer for years and never lifted a hand, bowed their heads, some in shame, some in awe. They had come to a harvest feast and they had watched a servant girl become a queen. The days that followed were strange and quiet ones for Alolan. The king did not rush her. That was the thing she remembered most about him in the end. He could have swept her away to the capital that very night, dressed her in silver, put a crown on her head, and shown the whole kingdom the lost heir he'd found. Any other man would have. But Ronan had spent 19 years learning what it cost when the powerful took what they wanted without asking. So he asked. He stayed in Ravenhollow through the winter. He had a warm cottage prepared for her, with a real fire and a soft bed and a rug by the hearth for Barnaby, who took to the new life with the deep contentment of an old dog who has finally come somewhere safe. The king had his own healers see to the hound's old wounds, and though they couldn't give him back his leg, they eased his pain, and Barnaby lived out his years fat and warm and never far from Alolan's side. Ronan came to see her every day. At first she flinched when he entered a room. A lifetime of habit doesn't wash away in a night. But he never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He would sit across the fire from her and talk about her father, the old king, about the mountains, about small foolish things that made her laugh, and slowly, day by day, the flinch went out of her. She began to lift her eyes. She began to speak first. She began to fill a room instead of hiding in the corner of it. He told her the truth about herself in pieces, gentle enough that she could carry it, that she was born to rule these mountains, that the silver mark she'd been beaten for hiding was the oldest sign of nobility in the whole kingdom, that her mother had been kind and her father had been just, and that the cruelty she'd grown up in was never, ever hers to deserve. It had been done to her. It was not who she was. And there was one more truth, the one he was most afraid to say, and it took him until the snow began to melt to say it. On a bright cold morning at the edge of the Thawing Ridge, Ronan confessed that from the first moment he'd seen her carrying platters across that crowded hall, before he ever saw the mark, before he knew whose blood she carried, something in him had gone still and certain. The old stories called it the fated bond, the one soul that answers your own. He'd told himself he'd come for a rumor. But part of him, he admitted, had come for her. "You owe me nothing," he told her. "You are a queen in your own right, with or without me. If you want me to leave and never trouble you again, I will go this hour. But I would rather spend my life protecting you as your equal than one more day protecting the world from your throne. The choice, like everything else now, is yours." And Alolan, who had spent her whole life having every choice made for her, having her very name and blood stolen, having her worth decided by cruel men, stood on that ridge with the whole kingdom she'd never known spread out below her, and she made her own choice at last. She reached out and took his hand, the same enormous hand that had caught the blow meant for her. And she held it gently, the way it had held her that night, and she smiled, really smiled, maybe the first true smile of her whole life. "Stay," she said. They were bonded that spring in the rebuilt hall of her father's line, with the silver crescent flying over the mountains again for the first time in 19 years. And every pack in the north came to bow to the lost heir who had come home. The timid Omega who couldn't meet a stranger's eye became a queen the mountains would sing about for generations, not because she was born to it, though she was, but because of what she did with it. She wrote new laws in her first year. Any Omega who was beaten in their own home could come to her hall and be safe. Any child sold like she'd nearly been would be freed and its seller judged. The powerful, she decreed, existed to shield the weak, not to prey on them. It was the exact opposite of everything she'd been taught. And she'd learned it the hard way, so she taught it with her whole heart. Barnaby lived 3 more good years, and when the old three-legged hound finally passed, warm by the fire with his head in the queen's lap, Aloin wept for him the way you weep for the one who stood between you and the world when nobody else would. She had a statue made of him and set at the doors of her hall, a crippled old wolfhound standing guard, so that everyone who entered would remember that courage has nothing to do with strength, and that the smallest, most broken among us are often the bravest of all. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, Aloin would think back to that harvest feast, to the raised hand, to the whole silent hall that watched and did nothing, and then to the sound of a king crossing that floor and the impossible sight of him kneeling at her feet, asking the only 2 words that had ever mattered. "Are you hurt?" She had shaken her head no that night because she was too afraid to tell the truth, but the truth was yes. She'd been hurt her whole life. And a man had crossed a room and knelt down and started, that very moment, to heal it. That's the thing about the people who save us. It's rarely the ones with the loudest voices or the biggest fists. It's the ones who stop, who kneel, who look you in the eye when the whole world has decided you're not worth looking at, and ask if you're all right. Aloin spent the rest of her life being that person for others. And it all started with a raised hand that never landed, a 3-legged dog who wouldn't back down, and a king who chose to kneel. Tightened to roughly 4,990 words. I trimmed redundant phrasing in the setup, the cabin begging beats, the king's introduction and the resolution passages, while leaving the 150-word hook and the entire ending intact. Every key beat, the wine spill, Barnaby's stand, the kneel, the already sold trigger, Garrick's arrival, the birthmark reveal, the bloodline story, the 2 fights, Aloin's judgment, the winter courtship, and the closing echo, is preserved.